2023 was an excellent year full of awesome adventures. I did have a few health problems that I believe I have now resolved, except for my frozen shoulder, which is still hanging around, but I don't let it stop me. Here are some of the great adventures I went on, with a little recap for each. I hope you enjoy them, and if you'd like to check them out further, please see the full videos on my YouTube channel. On January 13th, 2023, I headed to Kilbear Provincial Park for a winter camping trip. 2 nights of camping at Kilbear, which is something that wasn't able to be done before because Kilbear was just opening their doors with 10 campsites for winter for a pilot project. I brought my solo homemade hot tent and I glamped it up because I had a hydro site and I had my car right with me. I got to explore all the beautiful areas that you do in Kilbear in the summer, but there was nobody there. It was so awesome to explore this beautiful area and have it all to myself. Even though it was a tad bit chilly, it feels like -25, the waves were frozen on the water, and it was just a real winter wonderland, and I was so happy that I did this trip. Nighttime was peaceful, one of the nights, and I made some delicious food on my Nyko Alaskan Junior wood stove. I was comfy cozy in my tent, looking out my window while on my cot, staring at a beautiful starlit sky. What a great adventure. In early February, I spent some time in my backyard building a quinzy. It wasn't a camping trip, but I wasn't feeling that great, so I wanted to stay close to home, and I'd never built a quinzy before. It was really cool to see the process, and it was even big enough for me to sleep inside. But I'd never sleep inside a quinzy. You can find a full video of it on my YouTube channel. I spent Family Day weekend again at Mew Lake in Algonquin Park for winter in the wild and had a great time. I camped in my bigger homemade hot tent and invited my friend Riley and Lyra to come along. I got to meet Pete, who made a solo homemade hot tent just like mine from my videos, and I got to check it out. I also got to spend time and visit with so many people that I don't get to see very often. Some of them I know from social media, many of them I know from camping at Mew Lake over the past 7 or 8 years that I've been going, minus the COVID time. It was so great to see so many people. I even got to meet the new park warden and Steve and his family, who's the one responsible for this cool light. The evenings were full of fun as well. On the Saturday night, I had an outdoor campfire, and I had a bunch of people come over, and we shared stories. We had some pops, a few s'mores were consumed, and everyone had a really great time. It was such a fun night. My favorite hike of 2023 happened over Family Day weekend with Riley, Lyra, Tyler, and Jenny. We went to Lookout Trail, and with the help of some plastic Ziploc bags I had in my backpack, we all slid all the way down all the hills on the way out. And if you've ever done Lookout Trail, you know there's a lot of them. We had such a good time acting like children and laughed so hard. Family Day weekend at Mew wouldn't be complete without a lot of good food, and we had some really great breakfasts and dinners prepared by both myself and Riley, along with some delicious desserts. The gossip all around the campground all weekend was about this busy beaver. He was by the falls and he wasn't bothered by anyone. He just kept working away. We stood there watching him for at least a half an hour, and it was time well spent. After packing up, it was time to say goodbye to our lovely neighbors, and Sean did not disappoint. He had some fresh baked cookies, which were delicious. Thanks so much to Riley for a fun weekend and all the amazing people I got to hang out with. After Family Day weekend, I packed my bags and headed to Toronto for the Outdoor Adventure Show. I would get to see my new H2O canoe that I'd be using for the season, and I would also be presenting on the Saturday and Sunday of the show. I had a great audience to present to, and my presentations went well, and people seemed to enjoy them. I also got to spend a lot of time visiting with all kinds of like-minded people, and it was a great show. At the end of March, I went to the Ontario Backcountry Canoe Symposium and had the great honor of presenting at the last symposium ever. I got to present on Tamogami and visit with like-minded people, and I love talking about Tamogami. It was the biggest audience I've ever presented to, and I enjoyed it immensely, even though I did have some technical issues. At the end of the show, we had a little speech prepared for David Bain and some gifts to thank him for all of the symposiums that he's organized, both backcountry canoe and winter, that we have all got to enjoy. Huge thank you to David Bain, and we wish this event would have never come to an end. In mid-April, I headed to some Crown Land and McCrae Lake to do my first canoe trip of the season, my ice out trip. Even though there was still a little bit of ice in, I did get to open water eventually and got to enjoy test paddling my brand new H2O canoe. I had a beautiful campsite where I got to relax in the sunshine, and I even tried to put my toes in the water, but it was too cold. I made a great steak dinner on the fire and observed a lot of beavers doing some questionable things. I also was lucky enough to have beautiful sunrises and sunsets on this trip and a roaring campfire to keep me warm because it still was a bit chilly. All in all, my ice out trip of 2023 at McCrae Lake was fabulous, and I had a great time. On April 27th, I got in my canoe and I headed to the Gibson River. The Gibson River isn't too far from where I live, so it's a great option for a one-night trip. Plus, the water was still ice in a lot of places in the north. After doing the portage over into the river, I noticed the water levels were incredibly high and the current was ridiculously strong. After paddling down the river a ways and struggling to get back, I ended up camping right across from the portage. I also got to test out that new light that Steve told me about during Family Day. I made a delicious chicken garlic Alfredo and chilled by the fire with a nice hot chocolate. It was chilly, down to 2 degrees, and when I walked along the shore early in the morning, I got to see this muskrat stroll by. I was really anxious about getting out with the current, but I made it out safely, and all was well, and I was ready for my next trip. On May 5th, I headed out to an empty Gun Lake in the Haliburton Highlands water trails and had a great little restful visit. After a few portages, I was on Gun Lake and I did some exploring and checked out a whole bunch of campsites, which you can find in the video. After setting up my camp, I went over to see Brandy Falls, which I could actually see from my fire pit area, and I had a delicious dinner of a burrito wrap that I made with an OTG Meals kit. I got some beautiful pictures, I had some gorgeous scenery, I even had a beautiful moon rise above the trees. When I left Gun Lake, I headed out a different way than I had come in so I could see some different scenery. I ended up checking out some beautiful waterfalls along the way, but I did have a tree blocking my route that I had to overcome. After that, it was smooth sailing and a good time was had by all. On May 18th, I wiggled into my dry suit once again and took off to the Gamble Lake Axis in Tamogami to do an epic adventure. The first half of the route would be a lot of portaging, followed by a lot of paddling in the second half. But somewhere in the middle, I had to traverse down the South Lady Evelyn River, and I was told by famous canoe legend Hap Wilson that that could only be done when the water levels were high, 2 to 3 weeks after ice out. I was just a wee bit over that timeline and hoped I could squeeze through. After doing a small portion of the 4-kilometer portage, I got distracted by a trickle of water, ended up having to bushwhack back to the portage, and then discovered my shoes were broken. I ended up sleeping on the portage that night because I couldn't make it all the way through, but I had a beautiful campsite. I continued on the route and enjoyed beautiful scenery, some really tough challenges like this 1100 meter portage that reminded me of Cabin Falls, Bridalveil Falls, and Fat Man's Falls all put together. Eventually it was finally time to see what the South Lady Evelyn River would hold for me, And although there were some sketchy situations and some really shallow water and some enclosed overgrown areas, I finally did make it through. I got to enjoy more beautiful campsites. I also got to enjoy a lot of gorgeous scenery along the way, and I even saw a moose, and I got to catch and eat my very first brook trout, and it was tasty. At the beginning of June, I headed to Paddler Co-op for a whitewater canoe course that was set up by my friend Riley. We got to hang out with some really awesome people camping for the weekend. I had signed up to do solo canoe, but quickly realized it wasn't for me. I wasn't able to kneel in the canoe properly with my damaged knee, and because I had frozen shoulder, I couldn't lift the paddle high enough above my head to do a lot of the maneuvers. In the afternoon, they set me up with a pack raft and my own personal instructor named Finn. One of my awesome friends got a video clip of me doing some cool maneuvers here, and although I did go down the whole section of the river and I learned a lot about whitewater, it's still really not my jam. I did get to spend time with great friends, including Jenny and Tyler, and I had an awesome weekend. Thanks, Riley. For my Canada day-long weekend trip, I decided to head somewhere different, Blind River Provincial Park. I had a big route planned out, but due to health reasons, I scaled it down to make a smaller trip where I would spend more time enjoying the area and less time traveling. I'm so glad I checked out this area because I had a really great time. I enjoyed some beautiful campsites. I had some delicious meals, including some Thai coconut chicken from OTG. I didn't see anyone the whole time I was out, and I really enjoyed this area and the solitude. There were beautiful portages. I did a lot of relaxing because I wasn't feeling great, so I spread out the journey, and I enjoyed my beautiful Indigenous flag on a great campsite. I even got to see this really cool moon one night. Because there were forest fires in the area, there were gorgeous sunrises and sunsets. I was having such a great time, I ended up staying an extra day and enjoying the area some more. It was totally beautiful, and I was so happy that I came to Blind River Provincial Park. The route that I did provided me just enough challenge not to get bored, and I can't wait to go back and do the other half of it very soon. In the middle of July, I headed to Nanosh with my friends Jenny and Tyler. We had decided to do a trip on Family Day weekend. The sky was gloomy and it was supposed to pour rain all weekend. We set up the tarp and we were ready, but very little rain came, and we ended up having a great time. We had some beverages, a lot of delicious foods, even fresh blueberries in my pancakes, and Jenny brought a whole bunch of snacks. One morning, Jenny and I headed out in their tandem H2O to do some fishing, but Jenny did all the catching. Jenny brought something called a loon flute, and we had a blast trying to make it sound like a loon. These guys are great to go camping with. We had so much fun, and they let me pose them in any position I wanted for pictures. Just as we were doing our recap for the end of the trip and getting ready to head out, this giant snapping turtle came by the campsite. It was so cool. I'd never seen one so close. The scenery was stunning, and we ended up having a wonderful time, and I was so happy that we ended up going and not listening to the weather reports. On the way home, Jenny and Tyler wanted to stop for a cold drink. It was a really hot weekend, and we ended up running into Max Budnick and his girlfriend Thais. Max is a fellow YouTuber, although he has a few more subs than I do. At the beginning of August, I headed back to Tamogami and the Gibson Lake access for a 6-day trip. I was going through an area I had never been through before, and I was pretty nervous. The trip started off with a bang, literally, forcing me to camp right across from the access. But the next day, I made my way down the Lady Evelyn River to some familiar sights that I've seen before, including this horrible 50-meter portage, which is my least favorite portage of all time. Eventually, I made my way to this campsite, which I'd been wanting to stay at for years, and it was beautiful there. The next morning, I headed out, and I was lucky enough to see a mama moose and her calf hanging out in a bay nearby. It was such a magical moment, even though Mama Moose charged at me, but you can see all of that in the video. Traveling between McPherson Lake and Banks Lake was all new, and it was quite the adventure. It was very, very pretty and remote. Due to a forest fire that had gone through the area about 5 years before, the portages were a mess. There were downed trees everywhere, and I was covered in soot by the time I got out. But I absolutely loved it. Due to the campsite I was hoping to stay on not really being a campsite, I ended up having to crash on a beach across the lake. It wasn't very big, but it served its purpose. Out in the wilderness all alone, the scenery is stunning. I head to my next portage and find out it's not much better than the other ones I did the day before, as they're also in the forest fire burn area, but they're much longer. There was a huge bonus though, lots and lots of blueberries. I was determined to camp somewhere where the forest fire hadn't touched, so I paddled to the other end of the lake and along the way saw this beautiful asylum of loons. I ended up scoring another beautiful campsite when I got to Banks Lake and relaxed for a while and enjoyed the area. I didn't see a soul. The next morning I got up and I made my way through towards Trethewey. This was my second portage of the day, which is where I saw a lynx a few years ago. I didn't get to see another one, sadly, but I do love this portage. I spent the day slogging through the rain. I saw these beautiful whooping cranes and continued on my way to my next campsite, which would be on Trethewey Lake. I set up camp so I could get dry and change my clothes, and then I was fortunate enough to see one of the most beautiful sights I've seen this year. I was just showing the gloomy side. I got a full freaking rainbow. I was also lucky enough to see this beautiful moon. The next day, I made my way back out and towards my car and ended a wonderful 6-day adventure in Tamogami. In the middle of September, missing my Labor Day weekend trip due to health issues, I decided to do a 2-night trip in Tamogami on Sunrise Lake. After a few fairly simple portages, I found a beautiful campsite and settled in for the weekend. I relaxed in my hammock. I went out hunting for firewood with my new handsaw from Suluk 46, which I absolutely love. I also did a little bit of fishing, no catching, which is normal for me, and I made some delicious food, including this beautifully cooked salmon on the campfire, while I sat and watched the sun go down. It was a great weekend, and I really enjoyed my time on Sunrise Lake. The next day, on the way out, I experienced some awesome fog. So this is a bit more realistic of what I'm actually seeing out here. A little foggy. Eventually the fog cleared and I had no problems finding my way out. By the time I got to the access lake, I had blue skies and mirror water, and it was a great way to end a wonderful weekend in Tamogami. Almost every Thanksgiving trip I've done for the past several years has been a bust. So this year I decided to do something simple. The forecast was calling for torrential downpours and cold temperatures. So I decided to head out while the weather was still good and do a 1-night trip to Little Margaret Lake. I've been trying to get there forever, and I finally made it. When I got there, the rains came sooner than expected. There was thunder and lightning, but it cleared up quickly, and look at how beautiful the scenery was. By the time it was time to make my Thanksgiving dinner over the fire, the sun had come out, and I had perfect conditions. Look at my delicious meal. It was so tasty. After dinner, I sat beside the fire and enjoyed a beautiful sunset, and was so happy that I decided to come out to Little Margaret Lake. The next morning, I sat under the tarp while it rained and made some delicious chocolate chip pancakes and breakfast sausages. Then I packed up all my stuff when the rain stopped and slowly headed out back to the access. I was really glad that I did this trip. It was so much fun, and now I can finally say I've made it to Little Margaret Lake. At the end of October, I had an opportunity to go to Algonquin Park, and I hadn't been there all year, so I was really looking forward to it. I decided to take a trip to Daisy Lake. I'd never been there, and it was just a few simple portages, some a little bit wetter than others, to get there. There was also this really cool dock at the end of the portage going into Daisy, which I really loved. When I got to my campsite, I was soaking wet, but it was around 15 degrees. I set up the tarp and tried to get everything nice and dry by the end of the night. I tested out my new Suluk 46 grill by making a delicious steak on the campfire, and later I had a beautiful full moon. The next day I went exploring and found these gorgeous waterfalls on one of the portages. It was really pretty. And in the afternoon, I was lucky enough to feel the warmth of the sun because it was pretty chilly out, about 5 degrees during the day. For dinner the second night, I heated up some pork roast stew that I had made and sat by the campfire getting nice and toasty warm before the temperatures began to drop. The next morning, the temperatures started to go down, and I woke up to find snow. I was quite surprised to see it. After checking the forecast, I thought it might snow, but it didn't actually call for it. It was so pretty, and I really enjoyed being out in it, and it wasn't super cold. I made a delicious breakfast wrap with eggs, old cheddar, and some crisp bacon that I had pre-cooked. I sat and enjoyed the snow while eating, and then slowly made my way back out to the access. It was a great little trip, and I really enjoyed it. I'm so glad that I got a chance to spend a little bit of time in Algonquin Park this year, even though it wasn't as much as I'd like to. In mid-November, I headed out to Herb Lake and the Haliburton Highland Water Trails to test out my new hot tent and my new wood stove. It was a beautiful day, even though it was cool on the water. When I got to camp, I set up my new hot tent, the Isola 4 from Light Outdoors, weighing only 4 pounds. I then set up my new titanium wood stove from Fire Hiking, which also weighs only 4 pounds. This trip would be a test, the first time to lay out the tent with the stove and see where everything went and see how it all did before it's freezing cold and blizzardy and -20. Once I got everything set up, I headed out to do some exploring and found these beautiful waterfalls that I had never seen before because last time I was here, the water was too shallow to access them. As I made my way back to camp, it started lightly snowing, so when I got into my tent, I got a nice fire going in my wood stove and started dinner. I made chicken quesadillas, and boy were they tasty. The next morning I woke up to a little light snow, and I was warm and cozy in my new hot tent. I made some delicious French toast before I headed back to the access and packed up the car and headed home. My new hot tent and wood stove were ready for the next test. On Boxing Day, I would take the tent and stove on another test, a backpacking hot tent trip on Crown Land, something I've always wanted to do. There's a lot of rock at Go Home Lake, so it took a few times for me to attempt to set up the tent before I could find a spot where the stakes would go in and stay in. I eventually did so, even though the ground wasn't very flat and it was quite lumpy. I did have a really nice view though. I would also be testing out 2 brand new pieces of gear on this trip, a sleeping pad, the Neo Air Xtherm Max, which had an R rating of 6.9, and the Green Kazoo sleeping bag from North Face, which has a temperature rating of -18 Celsius and an extreme rating of -39. I got everything set up in the tent and processed as much firewood as I could before it got dark. Then I went inside and got my little stove going and started dinner. For dinner, I brought a tomato and cucumber salad with croutons and old cheddar, and then on top of the wood stove, I made morel mushroom pasta, using morels I dehydrated in the summer. It was delicious and hit the spot. I got comfy cozy in my bed to the best of my ability, but being on a hill and a slant, I ended up taking some kindling and pounding it into the ground to use as stakes to keep my sleeping pad from sliding into the stove. The next morning we were expecting torrential downpours within the hour, so I got up quickly, tore down the tent, packed everything up in my backpack, and headed back to the access. It was a great little trip, but now I needed to head home, unpack, and repack for my last trip of the year. On December 29th, I went on my last trip of the year at Silent Lake, camping in the hydro section with the bigger hot tent with my friend Jenny. I set up the tent and Jenny set up her hammock. We had all the comforts of home. It was a little strange setting up the hot tent without having snow on the ground, but there was nothing we could do about that. We had a comfy, warm place to hang out and cook our meals, and Jenny would end up sleeping in her hammock, cold camping. Jenny and I went exploring and went on a couple of different hikes, checking out some beautiful scenery like these waterfalls on the Bonnie's Pond Trail, or these other waterfalls that are quite pretty and near the comfort stations. Winter camping wouldn't be complete without a bunch of yummy food. I made fresh guacamole, we had ham and potatoes and cucumber, we had salad with cheese-filled sausages, and all kinds of snacks and special goodies, and even a few pops. On December 30th, we celebrated with a Happy New Year, and I had a great sleep in my new sleeping bag. Before we started tearing down, Jenny was kind enough to show everyone her hammock setup on my video. And I thought this was great because I don't know much about hammocks, and I thought if someone was interested, this would be a great way for them to learn. And so ends the camping trips of 2023. Let the 2024 adventures begin. Happy New Year. Hey everyone, just want to wish you a happy 2024. See you next year. Thanks for watching. 2024 wouldn't be complete without me saying a huge thank you to all of the vendors who help support me with gear for my trips. I am truly grateful to you and all of your support, and I hope you enjoy my support of you in return. I never ever will tell you guys that I love a product when I don't, and I truly stand by the items I use on my trips because they're fantastic. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you saw, please click the subscribe button. Also click the bell for notifications. If you'd like to get more information on the stuff I use on my trips, please check out my website at CamperChristina.com. Thanks. Bye.